Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second roundtable of the ISAS International Conference on South Asia 2022. This session is titled Regulating Mobilities and Shared Resources, and we'll look into the mass migration of people, the trajectory of migration, the challenges and difficulties faced by migrants and their identity in contemporary India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. Before we proceed with the event, I would appreciate it if you could mute your microphones and switch off your videos throughout the session. If you have any questions or feedback to share, please forward them via this chat. The questions will be consolidated for the speakers to answer later. Today, we are delighted to have with us the following distinguished speakers. Professor Sara Ansari, Professor of History, Royal Holloway, University of London, United Kingdom. Professor David Gilmartin, Department of History, North Carolina University, US, and Dr. Ritika Prasad, Associate Professor of History, University of North Carolina, United States. I now invite Dr. Amit Ranjan, Research Fellow, ISAS NUS, to chair the session. Dr. Ranjan, please.
Thanks, Winnie. Good evening, panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for joining us in this roundtable on regulating mobilities and shared resources. In this session, we have an excellent panel to discuss the movement of people, goods, regulation of shared water resources, and railway connectivity. Without taking much time to introduce the theme and the speakers, which Winnie has already done, I would like to first invite Professor Sara Ansari to make a presentation. Professor Sara, please.
Thank you very much, Amit. I'll just bring up my PowerPoint. Apologies, just for the slowness. Okay, I hope everybody can see my PowerPoint now. Amit, yes. If you can see it.
Yes,
great.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you very, very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. My short paper will draw on the book that I recently published, well, it's 2019 now, with William Gould, which we called Boundaries of Belonging. And in it, we tried to explore the very often similar challenges faced by Indians and Pakistanis in the decade after 1947. But I'll be focusing today on the movement, legal but also illegal, of people and things from the perspective of the Pakistani province of Sindh in the late 40s and 1950s. Just start with a sort of anecdote, I suppose, which was that in December 1947, the Madras member of the Indian Constituent Assembly raised the following question there, which was to ask the Minister for Relief and Rehabilitation to state whether the Indian government, was aware that ships bringing refugees from Karachi had been detained under the orders of the government of Pakistan, and why. And the questioner went on to ask whether the Indian government knew that refugees boarding these ships were being closely searched, perhaps as up being detained for as much as 14 hours before they were permitted to embark. Now, in response, the minister explained that no ships had been detained, though vessels carrying refugees from Karachi did have to spend about a day at the wharf for various disembarkation and embarkation purposes. He then went on to explain that the Indian authorities had raised the matter with their Pakistani counterparts. Both had agreed that there should be no search of refugees' baggage in either India or Pakistan, but for various reasons, this decision hadn't been implemented immediately in Pakistan. Now, this question, and I could have gone into more detail about the discussion, but time is short. I think the question in the Indian Constituent Assembly and the clarification that was provided by the minister responsible for overseeing refugee affairs underlines the significance attached not just to people, but also to material things, crossing or not crossing, perhaps, the new border established at such short notice in the summer of 1947. So from the outset, concerns were articulated, as in this case, not just into relation to people moving, but what they might be taking with them when they moved. And concerns along these lines mounted in the years that followed. So after 1947, what might be described as maybe the material fallout from partition came to figure prominently in the reality as well as the rhetoric of people's everyday lives, particularly in urban centres that were hugely affected by the influx and departure of refugees, and where access to things like immovable evacuee property became a key issue. And I've just put this map up because I thought it's a nice, colourful map, but it does show on it Karachi, i.e., the main city in the province of Sindh, and the movement that was headed in that direction and from Karachi towards India in the years that followed. So by the summer of 1948, so a year after independence, Pakistan's new capital, so Karachi that I just showed you on the map, like other urban centres in the province of Sindh, was facing enormous, huge problems in terms of how to absorb its hugely swollen number of inhabitants. So, the capacity of the city and other urban centres in Sindh to accommodate these new arrivals was put to the test. And so things like water, so we have a cartoon there just indicating just how pressing and I suppose the situation was when it came to the water supply. Anyway, these kinds of issues became the topic of much conversation, people airing their concerns on every opportunity. And on repeated occasions, Dawn, published out of Karachi, captured the frustration that was mounting at the deficiencies of the state. There was, say, for example, this comment included in the 26th of April 52 issue or edition in response to a wider ongoing campaign to upgrade Karachi's status to a full-fledged province. But what basically was being argued was that, it was said that a government should be judged on its beneficial activities and not on surplus budgeting, which was a big thing at the time. In present-day democracy, so it went the editorial, a national government is expected to give its citizens a minimum standard of educational facilities, medical help, healthcare, sanitary conditions of life, speedy justice, and law and order. And it called for the rectification of these maladjustments at an early date. And I think for anyone who knows, that part of the world, these are still problems that, continue to plague people's lives, probably more so, considering that Karachi is now a city of well over 20 million people, as opposed to the roughly 1 million that it became just after independence. But anyway, evacuee property, both in Sindh, but also in UP. So in our book, we were looking at Sindh and UP sort of through the lens of that particular relationship. But evacuee property in both UP and Sindh was viewed in the press and within, I suppose, their respective administrations as a major area of potential bureaucratic dishonesty and so forth. And if we take somewhere, say, like UP, there was suspicion, and I think this is a well-known point, but I'll just repeat it, that some Muslims had returned there from Pakistan under false names with the specific aim of trying to sort of re-enter, let's say, the state's services. And then there were Muslim, I suppose, government officials who hadn't migrated, stayed in India, but found themselves under scrutiny, really from the get-go. And this suspicion was further complicated, say, in 1948, when, there was that trickle of Muslims coming back from Pakistan attempting to take up posts in, say, the lower civil service in UP. So in June 1948, before a permit system was introduced the following month to, let's call it, manage or restrict the movement of people between India and Pakistan, there were CID reports in UP warning of what was described as, quote, a whispering campaign that was going on there against the movements and activities of those who've returned from Pakistan. And all to quote that report further, the various factors that it had highlighted had the result that the general public, as it put it, were beginning to doubt the loyalty of Muslims to the Indian Union. So this familiar, I think, story that we probably all know about, questioning the loyalty of people from minority religious backgrounds. But in Sindh, there was a similar questioning of national allegiance, I just want to emphasize, and where territorially, but also emotionally, the loyalty of minorities lay after 1947. And this issue in the case of Sindh was amplified by a number of high-profile cases involving the allegedly treacherous connections of influential or well-placed non-Muslims. So just as in UP and Sindh too, people moving maybe, let's call it in the wrong direction, or people moving in circumstances that created potential issues was a very important talking point, at least. So, whoops, a daisy, let me just trying, sorry, to move my screen forward. Seem to be stuck. Just sorry to bear, just, let's see. Yeah, there we go. So problems involved in regulating exactly when and how people and resources moved across the new border were highlighted by the smuggling that took place between India and Pakistan in the wake of independence and partition. And I've put a map up of the Punjab, which is obviously not really my area, but just to highlight that, you know, there has been a recent book by Indus called The Punjab Borderland, which has offered a pretty comprehensive social history of this stretch of the India-Pakistan border, highlighting just how significant the illegal movement of both people and commodities was when compared with the volume of legal so-called crossings. Now, in the case of Sindh's, perhaps even more leaky border further south, non-Muslim officers still working there were frequently blamed for involvement in the illicit cross-border transfer of goods, either turning a so-called blind eye to this or offering active support. And indeed, this illegal trafficking of goods, material goods, represented a source of particular disquiet, highlighting the instability of the physical boundaries that separated so-called loyalty from disloyalty or belonging from not belonging. And that corruption, well, was frequently associated with smuggling, reinforced its so-called anti-national character, and often, though not always, culprits were alleged to be working in the interests of the other state, even when economic factors could well have been the principal driving force. So you get increasingly reports on smuggling and anti-smuggling initiatives throughout the late 40s into the early 50s, with just some examples that I've put on the screen in front of you now, but within which members of the country's minority communities were often the main, I suppose, target of criticism, whether implicit or explicit. And we see some pretty explicit, pointing of the finger taking place. Now, smuggling was recognised as a problem by both governments, which was something reflected in the series of inter-dominion agreements that India and Pakistan signed between late 48 and early 1950. These, in themselves, I suppose, revealed how important, but also how difficult solving the complicated economic fallout from partition was proving to be. After all, austerity I don't quite know why there we go. Austerity was the catchword of the times. Perhaps, we're unfortunately becoming more and more familiar with that these days. But in Pakistan, there were shortages of basic food items. This could be rice in East Pakistan or East Bengal, wheat in the West Pakistani provinces, but also other essential commodities such as cloth, which resulted in the introduction or reintroduction of price controls and periodic rationing. And all of this, I suppose, meant that hoarding, black marketing or black market trading increased sharply. So we do see in 1949 drastic measures being proposed, and I'll just go back to that previous slide, to check food smuggling from Sindh, which included declaring that a 10-mile, well, in practice, 5-mile actually, strip of land along that India-Pakistan border to be a prohibited area. And there was the introduction of a compulsory levy on the total produce of local zamindars, who were the main culprits, really, as far as urban-based commentators were concerned. By the time we get to 1950, against the backdrop of, I suppose, ongoing India-Pakistan exchange rate disputes, a mounting number of reports about smuggling generated another spike in public anxiety. And then in 1952, that anxiety or popular concern about smuggling in Sindh reached a new peak. And according to arguably sensationalist reporting in local newspapers, massive quantities of commodities in short supply were being stored in secret granaries in cities such as Sukkur in Upper Sindh before allegedly being trafficked across the India-Pakistan border. By now, smugglers, frequently alleged by the press to be Hindu traders, were the country's enemy number one, and smuggling was frequently tagged, I should say, as an anti-national, as something that, anti-national involvement. So critics of the authorities, and there was quite a, set of debates going on. Not everybody automatically or necessarily supported the authorities' moves to try to contain and put a stop to this smuggling. Critics of the authorities called for the introduction, say, of a Food Grains Control Act. They wanted border patrols with special police, equipped with portable wireless and fully armed with modern weapons, whatever they were, networks of informers located in suspect areas, and crucially, the creation of, quote, the necessary socio-political consciousness, i.e., I suppose, public opinion, in the mind of the people against anti-social offences in general and smuggling in particular. By April 1942, the government had issued instructions for an all-out war against smugglers, and the authorities were permitted to frame special laws, including preventative detention, to fight the menace. Again, the response was mixed, and I think we need to note that not all of it supported such, proposed new policies. And I've just got one particular, alternative explanation being offered for the problem, and which put the blame really on the government, and rather than blaming the people for what was going on, really it was the government, the authorities that needed to take responsibility and bear that for this issue. So really, I think my time is really almost up. So I'm going to just bring to a close this really very short paper. I hope I've given you some kind of flavour of just how interesting this particular moment, let's say, is in the history of kind of the post-partition period and the movement of scarce but desirable material objects across the border. And I've got on the map a sort of focus on the Sindh stretch, let's call it, of the India-Pakistan border. But I think as a story of smuggling in the late 40s and 50s, and reactions to it actually suggest fierce competition for scarce resources marked the early years following the end of colonial rule in South Asia. And in regions such as Sindh, shortages alongside issues linked to corruption, against that backdrop of economic austerity, fueled public disquiet, triggered citizen complaint, and generated official campaigns, all the while raising hugely uncomfortable questions of where minority loyalties lay. So efforts to regulate, to contain mobilities, whether of people or commodities, in other words, things, I think proved a hallmark of Sindh's early post-colonial years, like that of South Asia more widely, and in the process, underlines the complex impact that partition had on lives and livelihoods over the longer term. So I'll leave you with that last thought, and I'll stop sharing my screen, Amit, if that's okay. There we go.
Thank you, Professor Sarah. A partition was carried out to address the issues of minorities, which are especially the problems, what happened that it created new minorities. Like in India, there was still 42 million Muslims, which was later reduced to 35 million, and Pakistan had 20 million non-Muslims. So thus for resolving the minority issues, created new minorities, and that created up citizenship issues also, problems getting citizen. You have written in this book also with William Gore. You have talked about in this book that about vernacular thing, then how symbols work in, especially in UP and Sindh. Then can you please elaborate on this during the discussion? Then second, Ilyas Chatta's book I read, and he talked about, there were also networks developed between the two Punjabs, and that helped the smugglers from one part of Punjab to other part. So was there any such networks in Sindh also, like Sindh Gujarat border, that helped the traders and others to help? So that you can talk, answer during the discussion session. The second presentation in this roundtable is by Professor Gil Martin, who will be speaking on partition through division of the Indus waters. Please, Professor Gil Martin.
Thank you. Let me put up the PowerPoint. Can everybody see that? All right. So what I want to talk about is water and the movement of water across the border, and focusing in particular on the Punjab. So we're focusing here on the Indus Basin here, but particularly on what happens with this partition line that, as I'll get to in a second, cuts across a number of canals. But the larger topic here as a framework for thinking about this is looking at and thinking about the way that the partition plays out with respect to water, I think highlights what is a very important subject for thinking about partition more broadly. And that has to do with the relationship between provincial conflicts on both sides of what becomes the border in 1947 and the larger process of partition itself. And I've titled this Rethinking the Dynamics of Partition. In fact, of course, this rethinking has been going on for a very long time. But in fact, as a lot of work has suggested, the dynamics of conflict between the center and the provinces is a very important dynamic in actually explaining why partition occurs in the first place. And so you can see this in Jinnah's conflicts with Bengal and Punjab, and how this shapes very much the articulation of the Pakistan demand. But one can also see it in the reasons that drive the Congress acceptance of partition, and how the, most famously for Nehru, the concern about provinces going their own ways is something which ultimately leads him and others toward acceptance of partition, which is a kind of national sort of thing. But my argument here is that this plays out also very clearly in what happens in 1947 around the partition of the Indus Basin. So, hold on, let me see if I can get this screen share again. Well, I'm sorry, it's not working, but I hope this will be all right. So again, this comes back to where I just was a second ago. This again is the green here is a rough delimitation of the extent of the Indus watershed, of the Indus Basin within Indian Pakistan, because it extends beyond them. And here is the partition line cutting across the Sutlej River and the Ravi River in particularly, but also, as we'll see, very much affecting the flow of the Beas, which flows into the Sutlej. So this was a critical moment, as many people have written about, including Amit. The instructions for the partition that Radcliffe got in 1947 allowed him not just to look at percentages of Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs in the population, but also other factors. And among the other factors, probably the most important was the question of water and the question of the irrigation system. So there were various ways in which this was taken into account. And there's been a lot of controversy about that, which I don't want to go into at the moment. But just to say, India and Pakistan, sort of recognizing the disruption that this was going to cause, signed a standstill agreement so that basically rights to water and flows of water would not be immediately affected in any way by partition, which was scheduled to expire on April 1st, 1948. And what happened on that very day was that the water flow across several key canals in the center of Punjab was stopped. And probably the most significant of these, though, there were various branches of the upper Bari Doab system that were stopped, and there were issues about flows from the Firozpur barrage as well. But the most important of these canals, because it goes right through Lahore, was the Lahore branch of the UBC, which this is not a partition era picture. It's a much more recent picture, but it's simply, I'm showing this to give you some sense of the importance of this canal to Lahore, which is a very important sort of center of all kinds of activities, particularly in the hot weather. So this was a striking moment because it was not just something that happened in a distant place. The flow in this canal was stopped and the water flow running right through the heart of Lahore. So there was a huge discussion about this. And of course, this is often interpreted as a key moment in the conflict between India and Pakistan, which of course it is, because India had stopped the flow of the water, and this led to very hurried negotiations. A conference was called at Delhi, and ultimately an arrangement was worked out, which proved to be very controversial because Pakistan later argued that the arrangements that were signed there were signed under duress because the water had been stopped and they were fairly desperate to get it flowing again. But in any case, an agreement was signed, and by May 4th, the flow was resumed. So this was a relatively short but very important moment. But what I want to emphasize, and what's really significant about thinking about this, is that in fact, this stoppage was really not directed by the government of India. It was not directed by Nehru. It was directed by the government of Punjab, of East Punjab. And Nehru, by all accounts, so we have some public statements and some discussion of this, but by all accounts, Nehru was absolutely furious about this. And though he then took responsibility in terms of exchanges with Pakistan for a fait accompli, he, furiously chewed out the government of Punjab, including the engineers who were involved in this. So from the very beginning, this conflict was not just about India versus Pakistan. It was about the government of Punjab versus the central government. And this comes directly out of partition because from the very beginning, Nehru was quite suspicious about particularly the Sikh population and about the continuation of communalism, which of course develops over time in a number of different ways. In any case, I just want to lay that out here as a kind of backdrop, because this really begins the process of negotiations, which are entered by the World Bank in 1951 and lead through a series of ups and downs that take, almost 10 years to the signing of the Indus Waters Treaty in 1960, which is the treaty we have today, which governs the arrangements in terms of the distribution of water between India and Pakistan. And so here is, in this picture is Nehru and Ayub Khan, and this is Eugene Black, the president of the World Bank. And of course, what this did, and again, there's a lot of controversy about this, which I'm not going to go into, but what it did was basically divide the waters in as clear a way as possible. So rather than try to organize some kind of cooperative management, which had been the original intent going back to the Standstill Agreement, the decision of the Indus Waters Treaty, and this was really proposed by the World Bank in the early 50s, so this became the foundation for the negotiations through much of the period that it was being talked about. But in any case, the three eastern tributaries of the Indus, the Beas, the Ravi, and the Sutlej, the exclusive use of their waters was to go to India, and the Indus itself and the Jhelum and the Chenab, the three western rivers, their waters were exclusively to go to Pakistan, except that there were various arrangements whereby certain levels of storage were allowed, limited, and these have been the subject of more recent controversy. But in any case, the heart of this treaty was simply to divide the waters on both sides. What I want to suggest is that from the very beginning, this may have to some degree been a successful treaty in allowing the use of waters to be determined, because both India and Pakistan accepted the treaty, they signed the treaty, and they have more or less committed to the treaty ever since, even through various wars. So the treaty is remarkable in its success in that respect. Having said that, the treaty was responsible for, among other things, generating significant provincial conflict on both sides of the border over the use of this water. And not just provincial conflict, but between the center and the provinces, particularly in the most dramatic cases is in India, which I want to talk about. So in India, the big conflict has to do with how what's called the Eastern River System. So this division meant basically the Indus Basin had to be remade in some ways into two separate river basins. Now, I mean, that's going a bit far because they were still connected. But having said that, with India having rights to use all of the water, that is, if nothing in the Sutlej flowed into Pakistan, or nothing in the Ravi flowed into Pakistan, that would have been acceptable under the terms of the treaty. In fact, that didn't happen right away. But the question then was how this water would be used. So one part of this had to do with the Bakra Dam. Again, not to go into detail on this, but this was in train even before partition and had been the subject of a lot of conflict between Punjab and Sindh. But meanwhile, once the treaty was signed, the Bakra Dam, which was by then actually nearing completion, went ahead, and the waters of the Sutlej, which the Bakra Dam commanded, it was used both for irrigation and for hydropower. The waters of the Sutlej were basically awarded to, went to Punjab, because the Bakra mainline canal both mostly irrigated Punjab. However, looking at the system as a whole, the larger quantity of water in the east was allocated by India to Rajasthan. So there were two big water agreements, both of them deeply problematic, that had to deal with this. So the first was the 1955 agreement. And you can see here the two things are noteworthy. One I want to emphasize, the other I just want to call attention to, but leave aside for the moment. And that one is that Kashmir gets very little out of this. And this is one problem with the whole treaty, that the needs and concerns of Kashmir were not really seriously addressed in the treaty for pretty clear reasons. Because it was extremely, Kashmir itself was being disputed. So this would have raised all kinds of complications in the treaty. In any case, the main thing to note is that more water was given to Rajasthan than to Punjab under the interstate agreement. And this has to do with the fact that, and then let me just go back to this, that this Rajasthan Canal, and you see a picture there, which today, and I'll come to this, is known as the Indira Gandhi Canal. This canal was really a national project. So the idea was that the main canal colonies, in fact, virtually all the canal colonies had gone to Pakistan. And India wanted its own canal colony. This was a kind of injustice of the partition. And the engineers on the Punjab side made a big deal of the need for this. And the government of India stressed the importance of the Rajasthan Canal. And the other reason this was important was because it was going to be the way they made use of the water. This was the claim to all of the eastern water rested on this project of the Rajasthan Canal. But it was from the beginning extremely controversial. So this 1955 agreement was signed by the government of Punjab, which was then under the Congress Party, under Pratap Singh Khairon's government. Later, it was the subject of huge opposition and critique, particularly from the Akalis, who argued this was a complete sellout of the Punjab. So this continued to fester, and this became all the more serious when the division of Punjab and Haryana occurred, and the water agreement of 1955 was redone in 1981 with this breakout. So part of this, again, and this is what's usually talked about, was this division between Punjab and Haryana. But what's noteworthy, of course, is that even Punjab and Haryana together do not get as much of the water as Rajasthan under this canal. So this was one huge issue that obsessed the Akali party. So water was a central element in conflict with the center between Punjab and the government of India. And of course, I don't want to go into this because I'm probably already running out of time, but just to say, I mean, the intensity of this conflict was reflected in the renaming of the Rajasthan Canal as the Indira Gandhi Canal, because that occurred immediately following the assassination of Indira Gandhi in 1984. And of course, the concern was to kind of create a memorial to her. But to choose to rename the Rajasthan Canal the Indira Gandhi Canal was a direct slap at Punjab in the wake of that assassination. And all of this suggests, I mean, how the Indus Treaty and the way it was set up actually sort of spurred this tremendous amount of conflict. So just and as I don't want to go into this, but this goes on up to the present day. So again, the Sutlej-Yamuna link was the outcome of this agreement in 1981. The idea was that Haryana's share of the waters was going to be transferred from the Sutlej to the Yamuna through this link canal, which Punjab initially agreed to. But then government after government of Punjab refused to do anything about it. So what's happened is the Haryana portion of this canal has been built, which you see here, but because the upper part runs through Punjab and that part has not been built, it has no water in it normally. And in 2000, I think it was 2003, the government of Punjab repudiated its agreement. And this has gone to the Supreme Court. It's still going on. So, I mean, just to indicate that. But I want to suggest on the Pakistan side, we have really exactly the same sort of thing. I mean, of course, not exactly. It's very different in terms of the nature of the conflict. But just to say the terms of the Indus Waters Treaty, the very terms exacerbated the conflict between Punjab and Sindh over water. So what it did was, again, just as the Eastern Basin had to be remade, the Western Basin had to be remade again also. And this was done through this massive amount of foreign money that poured in for what was called the Indus Basin Project, which is central to the Indus Waters Treaty. The treaty never would have been signed without the money for the Indus Basin Project. So the idea of this project was that it would move water from the Western rivers, including the Indus, to the Eastern rivers, particularly to the Sutlej, to compensate for the water that went to India under the terms of the treaty. And this led to this huge national investment in new canals, new links, new dams, and the creation of this huge authority. This actually predates the treaty, but this is the Water and Power Development Authority, which is the WAPDA, which you can see their headquarters in Lahore. Interestingly, for those of you who know Lahore, you can't see it here, but this is right next to the Provincial Assembly of the Punjab, and it dwarfs the Provincial Assembly if you're thinking about how democracy and bureaucracy sort of are weighed in Pakistan. But in any case, what happens is this project leads to considerable opposition from Sindh, not to the project itself, but to the fact that basically what's happening is the Pakistan loss of water is being compensated for Punjab from the Indus primarily, because that was the biggest source of water, which basically is taking water away from Sindh. And so this one link canal, the Chashma Jhelum link, which you can see here in red, which goes from the Indus, the Chashma barrage on the Indus to the Jhelum, and then from the Jhelum, it goes down, and there are these links that take the water across to the Ravi and to the Sutlej. But it becomes a huge controversy because this is taking water which otherwise would flow down to Sindh. So in times of shortages, there are huge controversies about this. And just to sort of conclude on this, it's interesting the way Sindh frames its arguments in exactly the way the Indus Waters Treaty itself was argued between India and Pakistan. That is, the answer that they argue for is not for greater cooperative mechanisms, which they think will inevitably be weighted against them, but rather they lay claim to the Indus River itself, that this should be the Sindh River, the river for Sindh, and it should have the rights to its water, the Darya Sindh, which in fact is the name of the river. And so there's a lot of polemics on this, and this is just one example. And so the robber canals here, the most notorious robber canal is the Sutlej, is the Chashma Jhelum link canal. So let me stop there. I just want to suggest how this the relations between India and Pakistan really cannot be seen apart from conflicts within each country that are tied to those relationships. And I just want to suggest in a larger frame that this is part of the critical importance for this question about provinces versus center that are really so important to the whole question of partition. and even to the question of why it occurred in the first place. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Professor Gilmartin, for a wonderful presentation and talking about the provincial angle to the Indus Water Treaty. Many in Sindh, they accused the Pakistani government that the Sindhi representative was moved out from the Indus Water delegation, and he was not allowed to be a part of that delegation after 1955. Then in Indian side of Punjab, you talked about 1981 agreement, but in 2005, Punjab government said that we just revoke its all treaty with the adjoining states. And then at that time, there was also issue that Punjab government came out that during the Indus Water Treaty negotiation, the state, at that time, Pepsu state, it was not consulted. But the one of the important provinces which both India and Pakistan ignored is there are many in Indian administered Kashmir. I talked to them and they feel that their waters are being stolen by both India and Pakistan, and they have never been a part to any agreement, and they want their water back. So this is looking at all such things. So my question that as the provinces, interprovincial water disputes in India and Pakistan, in both countries, growing up, and then there's also centralization. Simultaneously, there's centralization of the Indian state and Pakistani state. So what this is going to lead to means whether the central government will impose its own dictate that, okay, so you have to agree on this formula and accept it, or whether the state will have power to just resist. Then second, looking at Indus Water Treaty, many have questions that what future is going to be. Are they going to be, especially after a statement by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi in 2017 that we may stop the water. So what's his future going to be? So you can answer this question during the discussion period. Thanks a lot. So now, Ritika.
Thank you, Professor Ranjan, and thank you for the invitation. It's been really great to listen to both Professor Ansari and Professor Gilmartin. I'm going to be looking briefly, I hope, today at the, sort of the relationship between railways and partition. And I do not have a formal presentation, but I want to very briefly, if I can share my screen, just show one image. And that is, if you put in the word India and partition in a Google search, these are the images that come up. I did not put in the word railway or train. And I think it's enlightening. So at the bottom left is the cover of Yasmin Khan's relatively recent book on partition. But otherwise, aside from maps, what we constantly see is a repeat image. These are images that have been reproduced, as you can see in the Washington Post, the Wire, at the bottom is the Economic Times. So these images, the image of, whenever we talk about the partition of 1947, the image of this railway train impossibly burdened is sort of a constant. It's like a leitmotif that repeats itself. A crowded railway train with an avalanche of bodies clinging to it, people desperate to cross alive these new hastily demarcated borders between India and Pakistan, both in the east and west. And scholars estimate that between 15 and 17 million people cross these borders in what I think is recognized as one of the largest, but also the swiftest population exchanges the world has seen. And from the oral histories that are being collected, and even more swiftly now that the event is 75 years old, it is clear that a lot of the trauma still endures. And it endures for the individuals and families who survived it, but equally in terms of state forms. And I think we see it most visibly in the saber rattling between India and Pakistan, but I think most painfully in the relationship between the religious majorities and minorities in each country. So it is not surprising that these searing images of overburdened railway trains remain etched in popular memory, because I think they capture both the rupture, the border crossings, as well as the genocidal violence that characterized this event, which for at least a while seems to have elided the kind of historical analysis that I think in the last 30, 40 years has become more entrenched and more common. In a 2014 essay in Journal of Asian Studies, Joya Chatterjee had sort of stated, "We simply do not know why people who had lived cheek by jowl for so long fell upon each other in 1947 with such ferocity that has few parallels in history." And this was earlier, but in his book, Remembering Partition, Gyan Pandey had pointed out that for decades, this book was published in 2001, so he was writing at that point, he had said that for decades, a vital thread in partition historiography had been, and I quote, aimed rather at justifying or eliding what is seen as, in the main, as being an illegitimate outbreak of violence, and at making a case about how this goes against the fundamentals of Indian or Pakistani tradition and history, how it is to the extent not our history at all, end quote. So I think what I'd like to focus on in this short talk is this idea of the aberrant and the incomprehensible or the inexplicable, how this is played out in the relationship between railways and the history of partition. And I think in the most immediate sense, it has meant a limited focus on the more prosaic aspects of this subject, that is, of the tremendous infrastructural disruption that occurred during partition. And railways were, in a sense, both subject and object in that disruption, because it was the new borders cut through and cut off existing railway systems. So on 15th August 1947, 10,000 route miles, or 25% of railway tracks, effectively changed nationality. Two railway lines were the most affected. On the western border of, it was the Northwestern Railway, which was one of the largest in pre-partition India, and it had about 7,000 miles, and 5,000 was now in West Pakistan. On the eastern border, it was the Assam-Bengal Railway, and a little less than half of whose 3,500 miles was now in East Pakistan. So the internal logic of railway systems was severely disrupted by the Radcliffe line. Indian Kashmir was cut off from railheads at Rawalpindi, while in the east, Assam's rail lines were cut off from India. On a more human level, however, also, even as railways were mobilized for this population transfer, they were about 2.3 million people are estimated to have used trains to move between July and November of that year. Railway employees were also part of this displacement. So scholars like Ian Kerr estimate that certain occupations had become staffed more heavily by members of different religious communities. He argues that Muslims were better represented among locomotive and workshop traders, and Hindus and Sikhs were more prevalent in traffic and clerical positions. So what happens is, in India, as well as in East and West Pakistan, the railway infrastructure had to be significantly rebuilt, and staffing continued to be a struggle for years after partition. And scholars do obviously mention elements of this history, which I've just recounted, but I think the focus has been on the human tragedy, justifiably so, but this infrastructural disruption is definitely needs more attention. I think the second way in which this idea of aberrant and incomprehensible played out is the extent to which partition was captured, the experience of partition was captured in literature, in stories. And stories of railway journeys saturated in terror and brutality are a critical part of the memory of partition. whether it's Krishan Chandra's Peshawar Express, most of us, a lot of us will know, have read that, or Bisham Sani's The Train Has Reached Amritsar. And I will not go into the scholarly analyses of these because there are excellent analyses out there. Marianne Aguar has a great book. However, I think it's important to note that if this sort of dismembered inner world of a railway compartment had become a metaphor for partition, as it had in many of these stories, this same compartment had also offered the possibility of a moment of community. And I want to touch briefly on a story that is titled, translated either as Getting Even or The Avenger. It's S.H. Vatsayan, also known as Ajnaya. And at its core, the story is about a Sikh gentleman who had lost most of his family as well as home and his property in the communal violence. And he now has taken up refuge, though he calls it home, in the railway compartment of a train that travels daily between Delhi and Aligarh. So at a time when train journeys evoked terror, he made the railway compartment his home. And as he says, to avenge, in quotation marks, the violence that his wife and daughter were subjected to, he now constantly traveled in the railway train, helping people reach their destination safely. As he does in this story, he helps Suraya, a Muslim woman traveling with her children. So I think the story is important for many reasons, but not least for how it re-articulates home within a railway compartment at a time when people were terrified of the railway journeys that could, in theory at least, take them safely across a border. Of note, I think, for me here are the moments of contingency through which the logic of retributive violence, which is so deeply embedded in partition, is repudiated in this story. The conversations that occur without the intervention of this elderly gentleman would have most likely ended in quite different ways. So I think this idea of contingency or instability, if you want, undergirds the reality that railway trains were both and simultaneously avenues of escape as well as purveyors of death. The physical space of the railway, whether it was tracks or trains, compartments, stations, they simultaneously sundered, but also connected. And they physically, so I think in some sense, catalyzed the trauma of rupture from home and past. They hardened lines of religious identity. However, even in those moments, they also allowed for community to be constituted, even if briefly, only during the duration of a journey. So what has struck me is that this idea of contingency has been, in what railways do and mean, has been put down often to the charge of sort of the madness of partition's violence or the aberration of partition's violence. And yet, railway technology and railway stations had been defined by their contingency long before partition. They had constantly been subject to competing articulations of nationalism, both discursively but also practically. And I think partition sits in this trajectory in that it heightens this rather than ruptures it. Just to give you an example, at the discursive level, railways had always been central to conversations about what precisely constituted India's progress. In more material ways, they were critical to how nationalist elites physically transported the ideas of oppositional nationalism into India's interiors. So railway lines, which had been imagined as commercial possessions, conduits, for shipping coal and cotton to port cities, or as military trunk lines to control a colonial possession, or even as vehicles that allows India's colonial rulers to travel to hill stations, had become the means through which the message of Satyagraha was transmitted deep into India's interiors. Or railway stations, which used to be seen as armored and defensible spaces where imperial populations could seek refuge if threatened, became vital spaces for anti-imperial mass agitations. However, even in those moments, even as nationalist leadership understood railway spaces as a place where mass nationalism expressed itself, this mass nationalism that we see there often challenged the authority of formal nationalism. So in the 1920s and 30s, railway stations were also spaces that marked sort of the separation or gaps or tensions between elite and popular politics. Sometimes even while they invoked the elite leadership. So the nationalist leadership was well aware that large parts of popular everyday politics that occurred at railway stations was outside of their control. In fact, half of the 20 instructions for controlling crowd action that was issued in the early months of the non-cooperation movement in 1920 actually pertained explicitly to disciplining crowd behavior at railway stations. So I think railways broadly at its spaces were always contingent spaces. And, in a sense, they were also spaces where the idea of citizenship was defined or articulated. In one sort of sense, it was the needs of railway passengers that mobilized a large chunk of intervention by nationalist elites. But on the other hand, people in these spaces, if they were not following the dictates of nationalist elites, were explicitly also defined as rogues, to quote one of the terms that was used for the less obedient satyagrahis. So leaders like Gandhi, whose name was often associated with practices ranging from ticketless travel to the pulling of train alarms to dislocate traffic, insisted that these acts had no official sanction, but I think mass radicalism ignored most of these. And how elite authorities sought to reestablish control was by excluding people who committed these acts from, being formal citizens. So they actually put them outside the boundaries of Swaraj. And for a long time, I think, at least from the 20s, well, probably from the rise of sabotage and violence along railway tracks, so probably from the early 20th century, how one deployed railways, I think, had become important to separating citizen from non-citizen. And I would probably argue that partition heightens this rather than ruptures this sort of trajectory of railways in the constitution of community, both of citizen as well as non-citizen. And in some way, I think this tension continues today. If we look at the rail links between Pakistan and India, the Samjhauta Express is, the one we know best. And of course, Samjhauta, the word means agreement. But also, if we look at Bangladesh, the two rail links are, one is Bandhan, the Bandhan Express, and which means tie, and the other one is Maitri, which is friendship. And so I think this overdetermined idea that this railway is technology and ideology and constantly has to carry the burden of how these nation states and communities relate to each other. And of course, we see that every time there's a crisis, the first thing to cut off, one of the things that is done is to immediately terminate rail links. So, it happened in 65, it happened in 2019, and things like that. So I think this tenuous sort of understanding of railway as ideology and technology, as well as, a space that can create and sound a community, continues to be part of the fabric of South Asia's present. So I'm gonna stop there. I hope I haven't gone over too much.
Thanks, Ritika, for your wonderful presentation talking about the ounce of railway. After the partition, according to the interim railway budget presented in the 1947 November, 126,000 railwaymen opted to come from Pakistan to India, while about 83,000 railwaymen approximately opted to go to Pakistan after partition. So this affected the entire system, entire operation system. But still, infrastructure, some sort of infrastructure was still there. So how those infrastructure help when India and Pakistan decided to restart the railway service, especially with and India and Bangladesh, means after 1971, when they decided to restart their railway service, how do they help? Second, even for you and for Professor Gilmartin, how introduction of railway during the British time affected plan to develop Indus River as an important means of communication and commerce. Because I will go with Professor Sarah first, and then come to Sir Gilmartin, and then come to you. Professor Sarah, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I've just been trying to do two things: listen to other people, but reflect on the questions that you posed. So I might have got a little bit sort of disconnected myself in that process. You asked, or you raised the issue of symbols, didn't you, in when you responded to my paper? And I suppose, obviously, in that immediate post-independence period, with these two new states, namely obviously Pakistan and India, sort of creating themselves, if not from afresh, but certainly creating themselves. So symbols do become very important. And I think there's a lot of parallels, at least that's what William Gould and I could see when we looked at the cases of Sindh and UP. And I should just mention that, our choice of Sindh and UP as our starting points obviously had something to do with the fact that he's a historian of UP, I'm a historian of Sindh. But we felt that it could be a profitable exercise, because as I think everybody here appreciates, when we think about partition and we think about the period afterwards, we tend to sort of start by looking at Punjab or looking at Bengal. But, the subcontinent much more broadly, in my view, was hugely affected, hugely touched by, by its fallout, its impact. So, in this process of trying, I suppose, finding ways of performing the new state, then yes, symbols lay at the heart of either, personifying it or projecting it. And so there are definite parallels there. I don't really think probably this is the kind of venue or to go into that, but certainly yes, those symbols. And in that process of, I suppose, symbols, there are, that's where maybe, well, not maybe, but certainly we see kind of the symbolic significance, let's say, of minority communities coming into play, the sort of symbolic meaning attached to where they are, what they do, how they move, why they don't move, and so on and so forth. But I think in the case of both Sindh and UP, which may be, at least maybe, somewhat different to Punjab, but not to Bengal, because we know that Bengal, there was, a lot of movement across this new border. But, in the case of Sindh, its non-Muslim population didn't move, suddenly overnight. I mean, it was an extended process that built up a certain momentum, but Sindh retained, the largest proportion of non-Muslims, aside from obviously Bengal, in the new Pakistan. And in the case of UP, you had obviously people going to Pakistan, or what was becoming Pakistan, but coming back as well. So this movement isn't just kind of unidirectional. And I think, again, we all appreciate that, but sometimes we need to see it in action in less familiar contexts. So that was the first, I suppose, my first thought in terms of responding to your first question. In terms of the networks across the border, I have to hold my hand up and say that I haven't done in my own work what Ilyas has managed to do in his work. When I was looking at smuggling from the point of view of the book that William and I wrote, I was really thinking or wanting to see public responses to this problem, sort of the state citizen so-called dynamic. And so while, yes, I mean, I have no doubt that there were networks building on older networks that were being either strengthened or in a way recreated. I personally haven't had an opportunity to explore that, if only. But, you know, we know, even if we look at other things or other connections, we know that, say, for example, marriage, sort of connections across that border, you know, particularly within or among Sindh's Hindu communities, you know, has kept networks. I don't necessarily mean smuggling there, but networks live because of the demands that accompany finding a suitable partner. You know, communities that were connected in the past have become, in a sense, semi-disconnected because of politics, but those networks still persevere or continue. So I'll just stop at that point, Amit, but thank you for those two questions, which raise some really thought-provoking points.
Professor Gilmart.
Yeah, thank you very much for your comments, and I know you've actually done a lot of work on this. I mean, the question about the Indus Waters Treaty and its future is a really big and important question, and there has been a lot of controversy surrounding it in recent years, and I think, you know, one of the big issues, perhaps the biggest issue, is the one you pointed to relating to Kashmir, because the Kashmir was not really seriously considered in the Indus Waters Treaty. There was a certain allocation of water for Kashmir, but without any real consideration about the future of Kashmir and about water development. And of course, now a lot of the controversy is really bound up with Kashmir and projects in Kashmir, because the western rivers, the Jhelum and the Chenab, flow through Kashmir. And any development is going to be tied to those. So I don't have any particular insight into the future of that issue. I do think it's interesting that the whole solution, the whole framework for the Indus Waters Treaty, and this actually goes back to thinking about partition in a broader sense. The whole framework was to try to give primacy to a kind of national structure of control over water. So, I mean, a number of people have written on this, but I think it's just worth emphasizing that, of course, with respect to all kinds of movement across the border, there was a real, and including the movement of water, there was a real concern to try to establish, you know, what were seen as appropriate national frameworks for doing this. I mean, because it's again, I mean, it's hard to fully remember how new India and Pakistan were. Even India as a nation was in a sense created by partition just as much as Pakistan was, and as a bounded, you know, territory, and this pressure to kind of create a national vision. So in the Indus Waters Treaty, you can see this very clearly, this kind of preference for a treaty which would maximize national control over water, and which of course is one reason why it ultimately caused such intense conflict with provincial interests. So anyway, that doesn't really answer your questions, but really interesting things I think you raised to talk about. I mean, just one quick comment on the railways and the connection with water. And of course, I mean, the railways were absolutely critical to water development in the Indus region before partition even occurred. The canal colonies would have been impossible without the railways. That interestingly, the great volume of exports from the canal colonies did not travel by river down to Karachi, it traveled by rail. And as many noted at the time, this kind of canal colony development would have been impossible without railways. And so there is an old connection there. I'm not sure how much connection that is to the really interesting stuff Ritika was talking about, but I mean, maybe it does, but I'm not sure exactly how, but in any case, it's a very interesting point. So thank you.
Yes, Ritika.
I'll pick up on that. So as you point out, one of the things is that the Indus Valley State Railway actually was made roughly about the time when people like scholars like Ravi Ahuja and Nitin Sinha argue that for a long time, from the 50s to at least the 70s, canals and railways competed in those areas, and they were sort of parallel. And somewhere around the 70s, with the railway budget increasing tremendously, the railway sort of became significantly bigger in the colonial state's imagination. And the Indus Valley State Railway was, if I remember correctly, precisely around the 1870s. And one of the things it was meant to do was sort of replace the Indus steam flotilla, which used to actually transfer a lot of the goods. And the argument always sat strangely because it was that India's rivers are so unpredictable, which rivers can be unpredictable everywhere. But and so this was to replace or at least compensate for that unpredictability. But at the same time, railway construction was constantly redesigned based on how it would be affected by flooding and torrential rains. And they never really quite, and the way they really got past that was simply to block all the bridges that were put into the embankments, the water channels. They would block it to say that, and so I think it's a complex sort of relationship there, which is the trains were supposed to actually compensate for the unpredictability of the waters. And after the 70s, they replaced to a large extent the freight carriage, as you just pointed out. Go back to your other question, Professor Ranjan. I mean, I think one of the things that people noted was the transfer of railway staff that you mentioned. What gets lost in that is the extent of formerly they were called Anglo-Indians who left India at partition, and they were a major part, at least of railway staff. Laura Baer has a book, they were in fact called The Railway Caste, of the extent of Anglo-Indians who were part of railway staff and management. And and often the sort of upper hierarchies. And what this meant was, in a sense, that these positions were filled by Indian on either side, thus putting paid to this trope that had existed, that Indians were good for lower level work on railways, but not reliable very much for higher level managerial positions, etc. And so, but on the other hand, of course, it meant huge dislocation for a population that was closely connected to railway staffing. And it took several years, I think, for all countries to retrain staff into positions that that were suddenly empty. India, I think, the I don't know the modern history as well, but from what Ian Kerr has written, India seems to have seemed to recover faster than Pakistan, partly because they had to quickly rebuild these lines that had cut off, like Assam. The Assam link had to be built very quickly because a lot of Assam was cut off, and of course, like, up to 2016, it started in 1924, the railway budget was big enough that was presented separately in Parliament. So they would present the general budget, and then the railway minister would present the railway budget. The current government did away with it in 2016. But India's railway mileage is back to about 40,000 route miles, so it's pre-partition levels. Pakistan is about 8,000 route miles, so not an extensive amount of new construction, but I don't know that history as well.
Thanks. There is a question from audience that can a word on the impact of partition on geo-economics of the region be shared? So would you like to say something? Geo-economics of the partition.
Could I just make, I mean, this is totally pretty outside my comfort zone, but I would just say that periodically when we are kind of urged to think about improving India-Pakistan relations, this kind of happens periodically, doesn't it? One of the arguments that's put forward is that, countries in the region would benefit from, the more trade basically crossing these borders that are so sort of tricky. And so if that's what's meant by the geo-economic condition of the region, then one could say that, partition has hampered or in some ways retarded, restricted. I don't know, but I'm afraid this is looking at things from an angle that I'm not so comfortable with.
Thanks. Professor Gilmartin, would you like to say something on this? Geo-economics of partition.
Well, again, I can't add anything of any great moment. I mean, what Sarah said is really interesting and important to think about, because the South Asia region, in fact, in terms of the flow of goods or flow of most things, actually is one of the least integrated in the world. And this is really quite remarkable, given its longer history, when movements across this region coming from other parts of Asia were, very extensive. So, so clearly, something has caused this, and partition, of course, is the obvious reason. But having said that, even beyond that, it's strange. There's a real question, why should that have been the case? That partition should have had this long-term effect, because as you just said, there are these periodic blips when there are, agreements or increases in trade, but they've been sort of undermined over and over again. So, we really need to think about that as to exactly why have the effects of partition been so deep-seated and so long-lasting. So a lot of people have kind of had ideas about this, but I'm not sure there's any great consensus.
Ritika, do you have anything to say? The final word?
I guess it would just be to echo that is, it seems that every time there is any sort of, conflict or perpetuated conflict, trade links are immediately, along with communication links, trade is immediately cut off again and again. And I don't know if that is a kind of disruption that re-entrenches the effects of partition and hardens them. But on the one hand, I read arguments about how the region should function as as trading partners outside of this sort of conflict politics, but we never really seem to get there, because every time there is any tension, this is the first thing that is cut off, is trade links, bilateral trade or multilateral trade is cut off. So I think the geoeconomics is still very much subject to sort of the geopolitics of the region, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks all of you. We have come to the end of this session. I thank the panelists for the engaging discussions and invaluable insights. On behalf of ISAS, I would like to invite all of you to join us for the next roundtable session that will take tomorrow and day after. Thank you. Have a good day to those who are in North America, and for others, good night. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.